Welcome to the second part of our symposium today. It's an auspicious event and I'm very pleased to have made the effort to come and to speak to you today about Todd after the great work. So obviously that's a very long story because some of you will know how long Todd was in public life. But I'm only going to really look at the 1870s, most of the 1870s, just to see what sort of challenges continued to arise after the great work, or the Overland Telegraph line, was completed. I do want to thank the organisers particularly for encouraging me to come, the University of South Australia, and also acknowledge the speech of Her Excellency Frances Adamson. So where to begin? I've divided my short period up into three parts, and each of those presents Todd with a different range of challenges. The first of those, as we'll no doubt be aware, is managing the newspaper press. Todd was generally pretty good at this, but there were certainly issues coming up which he then had to deal with. And even though he wasn't a politician, he was a civil servant. He was very often left to do that without a great deal of government support. So I'll look at the immediate aftermath of 1872-83, keeping in mind that the line was completed. Certainly the land line was completed in late 1872. The second part, to which Keith has referred, are Todd's other hats, of course, and we know he was quite prolific and maintained control of several portfolios. So the Post Office, this was the new challenge for Todd. He had been, of course, Superintendent of Telegraphs pretty much since his arrival, but adding Post Office to that and then trying to amalgamate the two was, of course, going to be complex. And it wasn't helped by a series of unexpected events in the middle of the 1870s. So he has competing responsibilities. He's also an astronomer, and he's very closely connected to Greenwich and the British astronomical establishment. So there's some of I'll only briefly touch on those today, but the final section, 1876 to 88, looks at Todd's response to the challenge of cable duplication, because you've got one cable, but is that enough? And of course we know that it wasn't very long after the construction of the Overland Telegraph line that people started calling for more cables. Why they did that and how that eventuated was something that Todd had to be deeply interested in. So let's proceed. We have, of course, a period of great excitement and celebration in late 1872 with the completion of the land line. And Todd receives his Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George Medal in October, at the time that the Adelaide banquets, there was a Sydney banquet, there was a London banquet, were all proceeding. So this is certainly a high point for Todd, and you can see that in his expression. He was very proud of that medal. He wasn't the only person to be recognised, of course, but it was certainly a significant step, and of course later on he then becomes knighted, a KCMG. So here he gets his CMG. So this is a significant, I think, acknowledgement of his work. The ups and downs of 1872, Todd receives his award, official recognition, obviously very important. The banquets that were held around that time also acknowledged the work of the linesmen, the people who'd built this huge thing. And Todd was very keen to deflect some of the praise onto his workers. I know quite a lot of you are here, have a relationship to those people. And he was like that in most of his endeavours as a manager. He was always careful of his workforce, and it's a great tribute, really, that so few people perished in that endeavour, really in the middle of Australia, and lacking the kinds of support that we would naturally expect. The other good news was that South Australia had been released from its penalties for breach of contract. We know that it was a very expensive project, and of course, as time went on and problems arose, as they did in the northern section, the budget, of course, which was being borne by South Australia, was under strain. So once ironically, I think, the BAT, the international company who were sending their cable into Port Darwin, once they developed problems and the underwater cable dropped out, this then exonerated South Australia from its delays in trying to sort out difficulties which had experienced, both Patterson and Todd had experienced in the northern sections. Now, as far as the press goes, there was protracted silence about the underwater cable, and this was a point of concern because while we had the landline, remember Todd had sent his famous message from Central Australia, we still didn't have the connection to London, which was, of course, as Richard's pointed out, a very important cultural one, and for a whole lot of other reasons. So there was some concern about this. Is it how often is this going to happen? So this is really the very early beginnings of the notion of press duplication. The Patterson affair, Robert Patterson, we've heard a little bit about him again today. He's an important player in Northern Australia. Todd supported him, even though Patterson had his differences with the government. Todd, again, fairly typical of his approach, was to support his men. And he had to handle Patterson, who was quite difficult, quite reclusive, and generally despairing about the outcome of what had been such an overwhelming task. The other thing that popped out, and Todd himself had to deal with this, were insinuations about the stability of the Overland Telegraph line. And these came mainly from Queensland, but generally from sceptics in Eastern Australia who'd wanted a line which was going to favour them and come directly to them. So Todd had to deal with that, and he did it in an exhaustive and thorough way. But some of this was unexpected, of course, but it was also a sign of what might come. Now, I've got a rather distorted photograph here. It's actually the Captain Sweet photo that we've seen, and this one is an etched. It's at the time in which newspaper illustration begins to burgeon, and it's an etching which has been put onto an illustrated paper. This is the London News, so we know that Todd's reputation is now gone, well beyond South Australia, and the London Banquet, of course, confirms his reputation. So we've got the four major players there again. You can probably see some print above that because the Illustrated London paper reproduced a whole suite, if I may use that term, of photos, of Captain Sweet's photos, in fact. And this represents a significant change in journalism, which was often very tightly written, small print. I know, I read it for 5 years. It's hard going. But the move to illustration was quite an important one for Todd and his men, especially for Todd, because he was now being recognised, and there were a whole, not only did this paper circulate in the UK, of course, people read it here, and also you get the beginning of country weeklies, big papers. You've probably seen some of them, the Australasian, the Town and Country Journal, Queenslander and so on. These papers were being shipped out into the countryside. They were about settlement and they were of interest to the rural settler as well. So this was a timely moment for Todd's reputation because very often the Overland Telegraph line was in there and his name was generally mentioned, as were his photos and portraits. 1873 was a positive year. Todd's lecture, which has been mentioned, he delivered, and his personal account of July 1873 saw him on the front foot. And he'd always faced the criticism that this was an impossible task. His later minister was one of the people who got up in Parliament and said it was the maddest scheme ever. I don't know whether he had to swallow his words on that one. But Todd saw the big picture and his lecture was about that. So the capacity for micromanagement and detail combined with a very large perspective on the telegraph. It's really a history of the telegraph going right back to the laying of the Atlantic telegraph. And he complemented that when he went to Britain later on by writing and delivering a speech on the history of the telegraph in Australia as well. So the other positive was the replacement of wooden with iron poles, especially in the northern section where termites had sort of ravaged parts of the line. So this was something that it began systematically in 1873, usually through Port Darwin. And you've heard about Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is a long-term friend of Todd's. He actually comes to South Australia and sees that first line built to Port Adelaide, and he tells the governor, this guy's, he's got the ability to go on doing things. So that's important. And Oppenheimer and Todd continue to correspond on how can I improve my insulators, how can I protect the line from the ravages of lightning and so on. So that's an interesting and important personal relationship as well as a professional one. Now, Todd tended to basically dismiss ongoing criticism and concern about stability by saying we need ongoing maintenance of such a vast line. And to quote him in his July 1873 lecture, we must expect occasional difficulties and interruptions. So Todd was fairly, stoical about that. And of course, the linesman played an important role in maintaining those sections that had been carefully established. Now, I'm going to have to move past this middle period on the post office and also on astronomy. They're both, we must remember that they're both long-term professional interests and involvements on Todd's part. So even to the end of the century, Todd was an astronomer who got up in the morning to look at Halley's Comet, and at a very good age. And he was also, remember, a Commonwealth postal official as well. So this is after 1901. So these are not minor considerations for Todd. They're major ones. And they become quite important in this period for reasons which I probably can't go into. But if you were interested in my book, Behind the Legend, I've devoted whole chapters to these. And of course, they're really biographical threads that run right through Todd's public life. The first of those, the post office, the robbery, unexpected robbery in the Central Post Office, and a large commission of inquiry during 1874 saw Todd heavily involved in basically appearing before the commission, making changes as he went, and this took a great deal of time. I mentioned the unsympathetic minister, and the civil service, the post office was a complex department within the civil service. It was massive, and it was very dispersed. So trying to get his head on top of that and amalgamating post office, and then have a look at the expansion of the post office in the 70s, which is also huge. You can imagine what sort of time that would have taken. You've got to then choose people. There's a sort of postal rearguard against Todd's appointment. The South Australian situation is unusual. I've looked at the other colonies. It's really the only one where the superintendent of telegraphs actually runs the show. Normally it's the postmaster figure who runs the show, and telegraphs is sort of subsidiary to that. So it's a service within a civil service. The second one is the transit of Venus. The astronomers among you will know a bit about that. There were two of these. One was in 1882. The first one went badly for Todd, trying to get equipment from the UK. It was a similar story to the Overland telegraph line. Trying to get it shipped, trying to get it made. Everyone wanted a telegraph, of course, wanted a telescope because of the transit. So it got here late, and it caught Todd at a bad moment when he was heavily involved with the post office as well. So we'll go back to cable duplication, and we find that the telegraph looms larger in 1876. The question about whether one cable, underwater cable, can carry the necessary traffic didn't particularly worry Todd. He felt that, he knew as a technical man that there was plenty of scope within a single cable to reach Australia. But there was a fairly serious glitch in 1876 when a series of underwater cable breakages occurred, and these were not simple to fix. A linesman could go up and put up a wire in reasonable time if there were breakages, and there were a few of these on the land. But trying to draw up a cable from under the water and get it fixed might take you weeks, might take you months. And that was a serious problem at a time when people were now relying on the telegraph to get news back to London, especially the business figures and the newspaper press, which had come to rely very heavily on the telegraph. So I'll have to move through this, but Todd's first intervention was an 1876 report where he recommended duplication for the existing cable company. But he didn't recommend it for Java, to Darwin, or for the Overland Telegraph line. So this is where it becomes rather tricky. And of course the other colonies seize on this and start to demand that they get consideration and that other lines be sent north to avoid breakages. And this is Todd's anxious private correspondence in this period where he says, the submarine cable has been singularly unfortunate, nothing but breakages. Now, he didn't say that in his 1876 report, but there's a private side to his correspondence which reveals the growing anxiety in the late 1870s about this. And then to John Pender. Pender is the director of the International Cable Company that he is talking to. Our landline, though splendid, has not been without sins. We have had terrific thunderstorms and the blacks have been troublesome. So he's almost appeasing Pender for all the underwater cable problems by saying, oh yes, we've had a few as well. The tricky part for Todd is that he's very often the one who has to get up and sort out the underwater issues, certainly trying to assuage the Australian public. And he has to do so in an important Melbourne Telegraph conference where he tells Pender, I will use my utmost influence to maintain credibility for what was now called the Eastern Extension Company. He was a dominant figure, he was an expert witness, he was a recognised South Australian delegate. He was able to ask questions and give evidence. And this was quite an important moment because without that continuing support from the other colonies, who were going to pay a subsidy after all for these duplications, then the Overland Telegraph line might become quite unfinancial. You've got to keep in mind South Australia is still paying off large amounts of money because of it. So there are financial issues. The limited traffic of having a competitor would probably drive the Overland Telegraph line into insolvency and possibly South Australia with it. There's a lot hanging on these conferences, and it's to Todd's credit that he actually goes along. He's a civil servant, he's a very powerful one, and he really does make his mark here. So here's just to continue on from the first section. This is a shot of cable development in the 1870s, and at the Melbourne Telegraph Conference, Todd debates 3 connection points. So I'll try and show those to you, if I can get them. We've got Port Darwin there. The other one, which has been mentioned in the case of Queensland, is Normanton here. Now, Normanton, Queensland Government, through Normanton, will have not a bar of the Eastern Extension Company because it feels it's been betrayed, and it's true that there's a game of divide and rule going on. So Queensland's looking for someone else to come in, possibly Siemens, another big international player. And in the West, in this period, South Australia has completed its agreement with Western Australia to build a line down to Albany, but it's continuing to come up the western coast at this time. This is just before the conferences, and it's looking possibly for a link either to Singapore or even beyond towards India. So there are three possible points, and Todd has to debate which of these is preferable. Well, he's got a good start, hasn't he, because he's already built the thing. But he disputes the coastal, he thinks the coastal reefs in Queensland, he did come up that way to Port Darwin and to the Roper, so he disputes the security of that. And he also points out that geologically, people don't really know what's out there in the Indian Ocean. So it's a combination of that, and also his ongoing research with Oppenheimer, where he's seeking to protect the line, and also pointing to the stats saying, look, we've got fewer breakages, we're managing this. It's a combination of those things and his sheer technical knowledge as someone who's very capable, which I think swings the day for South Australia, and it means that the Overland Telegraph line remains the main conduit pretty much up to the end of the century. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and it's great to be here.
Have we got a bit of time?
Exactly on 11:50.
We'll get one question in negative time. Yes?
You mentioned the breakages in the undersea trade. Was that a heavier gauge than the land?
Yes, I think it was heavier, and they were obviously working on that all the time. I mean, you've got to remember that this whole cable technology was in a process of just constant change, really. They hadn't had a lot of success in Australia, but the British felt that landlines were tricky, and Todd had to go against that and say the landline is okay, is secure. He himself was experimenting. There was a lot of experimentation going on, but because of the tropical seas, they had to protect they used rubber particularly, a gutta percha I think it was called, and there was constant upgrading. Without that, of course, we just wouldn't have been able to be connected. So all the way down through Singapore, down to Java and beyond, there was a lot of work a lot of time being spent just maintaining those cables. And of course, the more you had to bring up, the more cost it was. So,
How deep did it go sometimes, Denis?
well, I think it varied quite a lot. It wasn't too deep at Java, but certainly there were other parts of that line which would have been quite difficult to pull up. And certainly, if you read the reports of the captains, they're saying, well, there's bad weather. We've got we can imagine what it's like. And never mind Krakatoa.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But it's constantly being experimented, as is the line itself. I think Derek will know about that. And
Yeah. Please thank Denis Cryle.